A lot of things come in threes. You've got 3 points to a sentence, 3 parts to a film as start, middle, and end. But did you know that you can also have 3 parts to a story? In this video, I'm going to be exploring the 3-part narrative structure and how to create this narrative arc, using 3 different acts for your stories. Conventional stories are made up of 3 acts, and Act 1 represents about 25% of your story. Act 2 is about 50% of your story, so it's the longer part, and Act 3 is the final 25% of your story. In Act 1, as a storyteller, you're presenting the world of your story. You're introducing your reader to the status quo, giving them a sense of their bearings, introducing them to all the characters of the film or the story, and just generally giving them a nice introduction to the stasis, the every single day, the everyday of your story. Think of Narcos if you've ever watched the series, with Act 1 being the narrator introducing you to all the characters that make up Narcos, their role in Narcos, and what their culture looks like. You're taken through the bars that they go to, the brothels, the home life, the couple relationships, and so you're getting a real understanding of the status quo. In the first act, you really want to give all the basic information that the audience or the reader is going to need to understand your story. So things like where the setting takes place, who the characters are, the challenges. You might hint at the sort of challenges that they're going to come up against. So maybe you introduce the protagonist and the enemy, the antagonist. So you're providing all the sort of basic information and giving the reader a real insight into the world the story is going to take place in. But in addition to this, you also want to arouse a sense of curiosity and that some sort of action is going to take place. So you want to just draw the reader into the story. So in the first act, you're very much teasing a sense of mystery and suspense by not really giving the full picture. So you want to leave out some parts of the story that is going to create some sort of intrigue for the reader. So where Act 1 is the introduction, or sometimes called the setup. Act 2 is called the confrontation. Now, this is where the inciting incident usually takes place. And the inciting incident is that trigger that changes the dynamic of the story, that introduces that tension and sense of conflict. And the inciting incident can introduce a conflict that is physical. It could be a sort of tension between the antagonist and the protagonist, or it could be a conflict that's sort of more mental. So, for example, in Fight Club, the conflict is those 2 characters, but actually, and if you haven't watched it, spoiler alert, the conflict is the hero's mind is the thing that is playing up against him. So he's stuck between these 2 different versions of himself. So it could be a physical conflict or a mental conflict. Now, this conflict is really important because the conflict is what's going to drive the story forward. It's going to keep drawing the reader in and pushing the story, propelling it forward. And you're all the while in Act 2, bearing in mind this is the longest part of the story, you're building up to that climax, the point which the conflict is at its highest peak. So you're trying to sort of keep the reader engaged, arouse some sort of suspense and mystery and curiosity, and build up into this nice narrative arc that reaches to the top of the climax. So the second act, bearing in mind it's also really long, is also where you might introduce the B plot or the subplot, where you see other characters being introduced to the mix. And this is why some stories can go off on real tangents. You might go down a completely different character route. You might be introduced to new plots and micro plots within the main plot. So remember that when you're creating a story, there's not just one plot. There are sometimes many different subplots going on at the same time, and that's why Act 2 tends to be this longer, drawn out plot. So as you come up to the end of Act 2, this is where there's this problem, this point of no return for the protagonist. So the point of no return is that part where the protagonist or the hero cannot go back to stasis, to where they started out in the introduction. They've reached this line and they've crossed it, and there's no return. So it's called the point of no return. So think of a story like Lord of the Rings, where Sam says to Frodo, I'm not going to do the accent, this is the farthest away from Hobbiton that I've ever been. Like, if I cross this line, this is the farthest away I have ever been from my home. So that's the point of no return. And typically in Act 2, the build-up of the conflict and the build-up of the suspense and the drama is so much that you'll see this this path ahead of the character of the protagonist that is going to take them further and further away from their comfortable home that they once knew. One final point to remember is that as you go further away from your starting point, the stakes also raise. So what you could lose becomes even greater than what you thought you could, than what you had to lose when you started out, because you're going further away from that beginning point, and the challenge is becoming even more great, and the risks even higher and the stakes even higher. So we're approaching Act 3, the stakes are really high, you're almost at that climax point. The character has endured a series of obstacles, they've gone further away from their homeostasis, they've reached the point of no return, they cannot go back to what once was. And Act 3 is where you typically see the final confrontation happen. So this might be a big physical battle, or it might be an internal battle where, the challenge becomes so great, for example in Fight Club, that they have this whole, inner journey and breaking point almost, where they just simply do not know what the truth is. They do not know who they are, and they've realized that something's not quite right. So you're reaching this climax and the final confrontation is happening and the resolution is almost there. So the resolution is where everything comes together. And this is all going to come back to the controlling idea of the story, the theme or the moral of the story that you're trying to get across. The resolution is where the character finally overcomes these obstacles and gets to where they want to be, or doesn't get to where they want to be. But they always learn something. There's a realization part to Act 3 where they kind of have gone, wow, look at this journey. Like, here's where I was, here's where I am now. So throughout Act 3, you're having that confrontation happening, that final big confrontation. So think back to Lord of the Rings, when that big battle is happening in Act 3, the big grand finale. That is all going on in Act 3, and the resolution is getting closer and closer. Like, they're nearly at the summit of the mountain, they're nearly where the ring is, they're nearly, overcoming and defeating Sauron. So you're wrapping up your conflict, you're delivering your argument, you're getting across the moral of the story and the controlling idea in this part of the story, in this third act. Now, what I haven't really gone into in this 3-act structure, because remember, this is a very basic structure if you're writing a story, and you can apply this to a brand story as well. So remember that this is a basic outline of the 3-act story structure. What gets really interesting is if you were wanting to just dip your toes into the hero's journey format, and I'm going to do more videos on this later, is that within each act, so you've got your introduction set up, your confrontation, Act 2, and your resolution, Act 3. If you go down to the hero's journey story structure, you see these smaller sort of subplots within each act. So you still have these sort of 3 acts going on, but there are things within each of those acts that start to happen. So for example, the inciting incident, which I touched on earlier, that normally happens in Act 1, which is the trigger that creates change for the protagonist, and sets them off on their path. So think of when in Harry Potter, Harry sees a real life wizard and is then he then sees this other world and is triggered and his curiosity is awakened. In Act 2, then with the hero's journey, they meet their mentors, their allies, the people that are going to guide them on their journey. And if you're writing for a brand, this hero, this guide will be your brand. And then they also meet their enemies. So what do they come up against? And again, for a brand, this might be the challenges that the brand is facing, destruction, or actual, if you're writing sort of a fictional story, this might be like the characters, the enemies. And then they go to this real low point, like the crisis, sort of crisis point. Like you often see this with the hero's journey, that they reach rock bottom and there's no sort of way to get out of that. But then something happens where the action starts building again. It's called rising action, gearing towards that act 3 into the climax, where the big climax finally happens and the resolution occurs. And usually there's this critical decision that the hero has to make in order to go forward. The point of no return, they can't not do this. They can't not take this decision, because if they don't, everything that they've done will have been lost. So they have to make this critical decision to save humanity or save themselves, or to avoid going back to what was. And then you get the falling action and the resolution. So that's just a very sort of brief summary of the hero's journey and how you can also apply it to the 3-act structure and start to weave both of them together to create this really rich story. I hope this has been helpful. Let me know in the comments what you'd like me to touch on and whether there's anything in this that you want me to explore more or go into more detail about. And yeah, share your feedback in the comments, and I'll see you next week.